Hey, welcome back to the Candid Sales Rep Podcast. And I am absolutely thrilled to death because in this episode, we're going to delve into Justin Emond's unique journey into being a leader, CEO, and founder and creating a delightful and complex digital ecosystems for companies like Harvard, VMware, and even King Arthur Baking Company. So as you can tell, he's had a ton of experience selling to companies of all size. You know what experience does? It creates experiences with decisions. So we'll talk about that. But Justin's going to share what is his approach to maintaining high levels of performance among a sales team and what have been some of the challenges in helping to grow his company. So I'm super fired up that Justin's here today, and welcome, my friend. Glad to see you.
Great to see you too. Thanks for having me.
Oh, this is going to be a fun time, and I know that because you and I know each other pretty well. So I guess tell me this, help me get the people who are listening. And you founded Third and Grove about 11, 12 years ago. Like, what was that journey to kind of come into owning Third and Grove and getting that agency started?
I was a freelance developer and I came at sales from a really weird place because I was a software engineer, and I was working on projects, but I wanted to really build these things the right way. But as a freelancer, I was brought into these opportunities after they were built, and I was sort of enhancing them. And they don't give these kind of large web projects to freelancers. And I saw so many instances where people just didn't follow best practices. They didn't treat engineering as a craft. They didn't really take the work seriously. And so I wanted to surround myself with people that believed in what I believed in and treating work like a craft, whether it was engineering or sales or PM or anything like that. And to do that, I needed to hire folks and build an agency and have a culture and then be able to get those websites and build them correctly from the beginning. So I came at this from an engineering perspective, and that's ultimately why I decided to go from a freelancer to starting the agency.
Well, it's interesting because we know that most people don't end up in sales because they choose to, right? I don't know, 15% of colleges have a sales program. The rest of us were like me, a political science major who decided to go in sales.
Yeah.
Totally different. So anyway, that's an interesting journey. So you came at it from an engineering perspective. I can already tell it was like, well, hey, we can build this stuff better and do better for people. But did you come into it and you were going from freelance to hiring 38 people? Did you automatically have salespeople for you? I mean, what did that look like at the beginning?
No, at the beginning, it was my business partner and I at the time. I used to have a business partner in the business, and he was more sales focused. And we grew quickly for the first 3 years. And so I just really focused on engineering and delivery and working with clients. But we got to a scale pretty quickly where we needed an actual sales system. And so that is when I stepped in because, he was great at sales and has a big network and generated a lot of those conversations. But once we got to a certain size, it couldn't just be like an ad hoc, experience. We needed an actual process. We needed data. We needed a tracking system. We needed to make a proactive effort to organize everything and sort of chase opportunities. And so that's when I realized this was the third year of business that I needed to essentially fire myself as the CTO. And I set a date on the calendar that I wasn't going to write code anymore. I was like, by this day, I'm not going to write any more code, which was at the time unfathomable to me. This was like 2017, because all I did was write code and I enjoyed that. But I realized that I needed to stop doing that and figure out this like sales thing. Because at the time, I thought sales was like used car salesman shit. And I'm an engineer, right? So like sales was weird and gross. But I knew I had to do it to operationalize it and to begin to put something in place that could start to scale us because we were just going to fall back in size if we didn't get some more rigor in the process.
So let me come at this from a slightly different angle. People always talk, oh, we need process. Oh, we need this. What happens if you hadn't done that? Where do you think the difference would be in where you are today versus if you just kind of followed the same kind of standardized playbook? We've got some salespeople, we throw them out in the world. I mean, what do you think the impact was of actually firing yourself as a CTO and coming in and adding in the process and the things that need to be done versus, hey, we're just going to grow this thing. I'm going to keep doing my thing. I'm going to keep writing code and we'll hire some salespeople.
I don't think we would be nearly the size that we are today. I think we would still be a business for sure, but I think we were about a third as big then, and I think we'd still be about a third as large. And I think we would just be that size, and we'd continue riffing, and things would come in when they came in, and we would be happy about that. And then there'd be droughts that would be painful and stressful. So I think we'd be smaller. I think the business would be less predictable. I think the most valuable business is a predictable business, and so I think we would have continual massive swings in terms of when we're busy and when we're not busy. We still have those. Every agency does. Like that's definitely like the true everywhere. But I think those like highs and lows would be that roller coaster would be a lot more dramatic, I think, than it is today. So I think a lot of the growth has come from the opportunities for the growth we could capture because of that system. Our people are always what are going to drive growth in the agency by doing good work for folks. But if you don't have a system in place with the processes and motions to capture those opportunities and chase them and win them at a good rate, then I think you lose out on those growth opportunities.
If I were to ask you to put, say, the last 11 years into like phases when it comes to your sales maturity to some extent. So the first question is, how many phases do you think that you could identify without getting really crazy?
3, definitely 3.
Awesome. Okay. So let's call this phase one. In phase one, going from, hey, we've got one founder who's pretty darn good at selling, gets us some work, gets some stuff done, and we're going to start implementing process. What's the most beneficial thing that you did in that first phase?
In phase 1 for the business, I think establish credibility of the work. I think that was probably the single most thing. Like we got good from a technical perspective in the narrow areas that we played, and I think there are still some clients from year 1 that I'm friends with that I text with today, and so building some of that initial trust, credibility, those initial case studies. We got some larger accounts because we just kind of hustled before pitch meetings to build stuff ahead of time and show them. So I think that like early hustle and credibility building in terms of like, hey, like we can deliver, I think that probably was the biggest thing that helped us in that phase 1, which I would call like the ad hoc era, It's very ad hoc.
So what was the biggest mistake you made when you're no longer coding and you're thinking, oh, I'm going to build process, like from trying to like, okay, let's advance and get ready to scale sales?
There were a lot of mistakes, definitely. I think there were a bunch. I mean, I'm aware of more of them more recently. I think probably the biggest mistake at the time was resistance to standardizing some of the offerings that we did, because we do services and we don't have a menu of services. We still don't. I think that's pretty common with agencies, but I really resisted sort of like more patterns around estimating and things like that could have saved us some time. I resisted that for too long because I thought everything was 100% bespoke, but it really isn't 100% bespoke. It's probably 50% bespoke, right? And there's similarities. So I think not looking for the patterns and taking advantage of them was definitely something that dragged us for a bit. I think the second big mistake was we got kind of a formula on how we responded, and we just on like proposals and stuff, and we just got stuck on the formula.
Yeah, that'll happen because it's easy. It's path of least resistance.
It is. Yeah.
So identify. So phase 2. If you were going to tell me what phase 2 is, if you were going to define that for me, what would be the definition of phase 2 of growth?
Okay, phase 2 was about, I think, a system. So it was about data. We didn't really have a system or data. So we put a CRM in place to be like, what the heck's going on? Like that was the first thing, is like, what is the lay of the land? What are the opportunities? What are the stages? Like that was key to getting into phase 2, which was just getting our arms around the state of things and tracking it. I think that was key. I think the second piece of phase 2 was starting to, that was the first time we had a master proposal deck. So we actually had a keynote file that we grew over time with slides that we had used from previous pitches and sort of generic slides that we could reuse each time. So we didn't even have some of that template stuff. So I think our templates got better in that second phase. So I think data was a big piece of it. And then I think that was a big piece. And I would say the third piece is this is probably when we learned how to do channel. And as a sales motion, this is really when we got I sort of learned it accidentally, but I think we got over a couple of years. And then in phase 2, we got good and we understood sort of the foundational pillars of what good channel looks like, good channel motion.
So dive deeper into this for me. So you started to use tech to maximize your ability to sell. Tell me how you think teams can best do that. And even back then, what you first did versus you and I were talking before the show that you actually had some other technologies that you're using today in order to help the sales motions of your company.
Yeah, I think at first it was like when I want technology, I want something that makes me efficient and is pretty low friction. I think people often don't do the level of hygiene they think they're going to do, and organizations do. And so I want to move. I generally prefer speed over precision, which has drawbacks and has a lot of pros and cons, but generally is trying to move the business forward. I think that's where I generally lean on that spectrum. And so I want a technology that's not going to slow us down as much, but give us enough value where I'll deal with sort of the drag on doing it. There's I think a sweet spot in process. At the end of the day, everything boils down to people. So process is good and rigor is good, but you can't have too much of it because, this isn't an orchestra. I think it's kind of jazz at the end of the day. But I think for like tooling and specifically, it was like, what's a tool that's just going to let me work a little bit more efficiently and a little bit more accurately, but still move and maintain good momentum. I think now, fast forwarding to today, we're looking at more tools that help us support our sales motions, but we're in kind of that third phase when you were asking about those three phases. And today we need a little bit more technology to support the level of sophistication. But the technology doesn't come first. I think the approach and sophistication comes first, and then we plug in the technology to support it.
Yeah. It's interesting because oftentimes, what we see with teams is that sales managers, CEOs, whatever, they'll put in the technology and then they'll hide behind their, computer screen. And they'll just be like, oh, we're just going to look at dashboards all day and that's going to grow the company. How do you balance that idea of that sales tech stack overwhelm, the marketing tech stack overwhelm, with actually using it to become more efficient and actually drive activities?
I would say hammer the really narrow things that matter. So the long-term vision, short-term focus, right? That's what it's all about. I think both in sales and sort of both in business too. But it's, there's a lot of fields in the CRM. There's like three that we care about, and being really focused and intentional about what those ones that we care about, because those particular pieces of data allow us to predict, to forecast, to understand good deal hygiene. So just constantly chasing those things. I mean, it's an everyday activity. Discipline is not... there's no like big, major, massive things in business. Those are very few, and you might not even control when they occur. But I think a lot of it is just that daily rigor and that daily discipline and that daily consistency and commitment to I'm just going to keep hammering this, and it doesn't make me tired because that's what I do every day, And so it's just like the core parts of it that I think are key, and just being like laser focused on those, and just being a broken record and not caring that you're a broken record. I don't.
That's the hard part, is not caring, I think.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah, everybody's saying it. Okay, so one of the things we haven't spoken about, and I know that this is something that's near and dear to Tag's approach, with all that being said and the focus on tech and moving stuff forward, and, Deming says have a bias for action, how do you incorporate putting the client where they're at the center of that approach?
So I think there's two parts to this. I think the first part I learned on my own in phase 2, and then I think the second part I learned a ton about this from you, and I would sort of talk about in phase 3. But I think in phase 2, it was like, just imagine you hire somebody to renovate your kitchen, right? The people you probably like the best when you're talking to different contractors, like none of us, I don't know anything about I don't know anything about redoing kitchens, right? It's like I can't really evaluate them on like the skills of renovating a kitchen. And most of us can, some of us can, most of us can't. But like the ones that get back to me quickly, the ones that respond in comprehensive ways, that give me good looking proposals, that answer, if I send them 10 questions, they give me 10 answers quickly, like the precision, the rigor, the cleanliness, and the speed. And so they're probably going to be the ones that I say I'll like the best, or I'll work backwards into saying that they're the best option, even though I just like them because they're responding to me. So I think I figured that out in sales, and there's something I've said a million times at Tag, and I'll say it over and over again, which is all business is sales. And so whether we're busy or we're slow, like I'm going to pull people and we're going to chase deals very, very aggressively, because we always need to feed the beast in an agency. Like our contracts are always ending in 6 months or 12 months or 18 months or 24 months. So we always have to do that. So I think the first piece was just putting the client at the center, which is like helping them really quickly. And that's the same thing in terms of delivery. Like if they have a problem with their website and they're a client of ours, we're going to move as quickly as we possibly can to fix that. And in sales, it's the same thing. How quickly can we talk? If they email me in the morning, great. Can you talk in 2 hours? And then if they ask a question, I respond really quickly. So just like really, really high velocity, I think helps people feel valued. If you're slow in the sales process, what do they think the delivery process is going to be like, right? So that's just makes them feel important. I think more broadly, and this is what I didn't learn until, and thanks to you, in sort of the phase 3 era of sales, I think there's a lot of smaller things that you can do to improve that motion, both with how they interact with you, but then how you help them sell what they're trying to do internally. And there's a lot of good hygiene around that I didn't really ever grasp until working with you.
Well, that's cool. Thank you very much. Talk to me a little bit. Is there a way that you look at deals that you start to ask questions about whether or not that deal's in a good spot or a bad spot? I mean, there's certain things that our teams do really well, and there's certain things that our teams don't do. I'm curious whether or not if you're a CEO objectively looking at somebody else's business, what would you be looking for?
Yeah, I think a couple things. I think managing the budget up front. And so whenever there's a surprise about a budget in a sales process, it probably means that it's our fault and that we didn't do a good job of understanding the budget early, communicating it early, getting aligned with budget goals early, understanding and getting those expectations aligned. So I think that one is a big flag if that happens. I think if I was looking at other orgs, I'd be looking at hygiene of core data. So are they actually tracking the data that they think? I'd be looking at what they're measuring, because you can get lost. Like analytics, like Google Analytics is a great way to waste a lot of time, right? And there's so much data in CRM tools for sales. Like you can waste so much time looking at so many KPIs in sales, but there's probably like three that matter, and the rest of them are vanity metrics. And so I definitely have seen sales orgs at other agencies like obsess about the vanity metrics, and they'll talk about them, and the whole time I'm thinking like, okay, this is cool, but these don't matter. Like, I don't care about these, you know? Like, what's actually going to close? I think the third thing I'm always sniffing out is like realism. And sales is like this weird motion where I think if you're reasonably good, you're losing 4 out of 5 times, right? I think there's like a baseball analogy in here. Like I think you're in the Hall of Fame if you hit 3 out of every 10 swings or something, you know? Like you lose way more than you win in sales. And so it's just a meditation on failure and sort of dealing with that. And so the realism part, I think, is really easy not to be realistic in sales because like hope is not a strategy, but some people think it is in sales. And so like if I see a rep or a team like, oh, this is going to close, like, but why? Why do you think that? What have you heard? Oh, they've been quiet. Like, what makes you so confident? And when you sort of dig in and you realize it's sort of just like shallow hope, then I feel like, okay, this person isn't being realistic. We're going to miss this deadline. This is not as good a deal as we thought. Like, it's just, you got to dig below the surface layer. Then usually you can usually tell pretty quickly.
Yeah, it's interesting because we always say, and you've heard me say this too, that we think that CEOs, VPs of sales, whatever it looks like, leadership should be able to forecast with a 90% accuracy 90 days out. And so a lot of the things that you're talking about are that hygiene.
Yeah, I think so. But and the hygiene's key. But I think there's like a personality clash because you have to have an unfailing sense of self-confidence in order to do many jobs. Sales is one of them because again, like I said, like you lose more than you win. Like you're being told 4 out of 5 times that you're not good enough. And then every time you pitch, you have to believe that you're good enough, you know? And you do that for years and years. I mean, I've lost probably thousands of deals and won high hundreds, right, in terms of that ratio. And I've been told so many times that we're not good enough, the proposal wasn't good, the estimate was wrong, didn't like the team, just a million things, right? But that unfailing sense of self-confidence does lend you to being like hope is a strategy. And so every deal is an opportunity and everything is closable. So there is, I think, that tension between that realism and hope that like you kind of need the hope to keep doing the job, but then you need the realism to be honest about what's actually going to close.
Perfect. And so now's when I'm going to move into the moment that you have. Someone asking the question you wouldn't think. I'd be totally remiss if I don't get a great CEO on the podcast like you, and then ask you, what is it that like sales reps and account managers can do better to improve their relationship with those above them?
I would say commitment to perspective on why there are certain things that leadership cares about and understanding why leadership cares about that and then getting aligned to it. And whether you think it's a priority or not, other people have different priorities and the priority of the people that you report up to is really important. So I think trying to understand and see the world from their perspective and what they care about is, I think, is probably the key there. There's like a trust battery. Toby, the founder of Shopify, likes to talk about this like trust battery concept. And so if I feel like there's an understanding and appreciation and a commitment to the core things that are important in sales motions, then my trust battery with that person is going to be really high and that person's going to get latitude. But if you go in and there's not a misalignment there, then even if the performance might be decent, like that trust I think is going to be lower and it's just not going to be like as efficient a collaboration. So I would say really just be thoughtful about why the person is asking that. Now, if it's a bad leader, they are probably asking for the wrong things. And so that's fair. But if every leader you've worked for is bad, then it's probably you and not the leader. But if every third leader is bad, it's probably the leader and not you, you know? So just sort of be honest about if this is something that you sort of a challenge that keeps happening to you or not. There are plenty of bad leaders out there, but there are plenty of good ones too.
Yeah, I think, the downside of sales, right? Second most in-demand profession in the world and the highest turnover. So
Mm-hmm.
30% of sellers are always on the street. And oh, by the way, VPs of sales leaders only last 18 months too. So you get a lot of that.
That's wild. That's a tough churn. Yeah.
Yeah. You wouldn't have signed up for it if you had to go that way. So you're glad you founded a company.
I am on the worst day. It's the best job I've ever had. Yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, you've had a lot of experience across different type accounts, right? So it's everything from the small account that wants to spend, I don't know, I'll underemphasize 10 grand to the account that wants to spend, millions.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think something that's interesting is I don't know that people fully understand some of the differences in how like selling to the kind of the lower value deal versus selling an enterprise account or a large account like Harvard or VMware, like you all have done. Talk to us a little bit about what do you think are the biggest differences between kind of selling the smaller person when you have access to like the CEO or the decision maker and then selling to those larger accounts?
Well, I think one major difference is procurement and contracts. So a smaller organization can move much quicker in terms of signing opportunities. And then a larger organization has usually a really onerous process to get through procurement contracts to get all that negotiated. So a major difference there is there's always going to be a lot more, I think, back and forth on like a MSA, like a master services agreement with a larger client, whereas a smaller client might just sign it. That's not universally true, but it's far more larger organizations are just going to have onerous contract and approval processes. I think that's key. I think a second piece in terms of selling, which can be challenging, is a larger organization may or may not be honest with themselves about how much internal bureaucracy will play into the cost of the project, both in terms of the hours and the ultimate timeline. And a smaller organization is much more nimble. And so if they're not sort of honest about that difference in pacing and internals, like we've had large accounts that have like, the designs have to go through 4 different committees to get approved, and it's one after the other. It just works up a ladder, and that takes a lot longer than just 3 people that approve it. And so I think that is hard to communicate and validate, because it's like you might look at it in the sales process and be like, that's a lot of project management time, and it's like, well, yeah, but like, there's a lot of complexity, there's a lot of stakeholders, a lot of people involved. Like it takes time to do things, and so that education has always been, I think, a challenge for us from a larger org. Other major differences, I think. I like to think about some things that are the same, and Jeff Bezos likes to talk about that. Like, you can focus on the differences, but you can also just focus on what things won't change. And whether you're selling a really huge deal or a really small deal, it is like we are all monkeys in shoes at the end of the day. And so you are selling to people, and you're often selling to individuals of people. And so those kinds of things I think are similar. One other difference I would call out is that the distance between who you're talking to and the actual decision makers can be way bigger in bigger organizations, and it's not always apparent. If you do your job, then it's apparent to you, but it's really easy to miss out the fact in a larger organization that you're actually not talking to anyone who's even close to a decision maker.
Yeah, I think oftentimes we'll see sellers, they will talk themselves into the fact that Mary actually has approval. Like Mary is the one who can sign the check. Mary actually has to go through 3 levels and up to the board. So
that's right. That's exactly.
It can be very different. So tell me a little bit then. So one of the things I think you highlighted was that we're all people. Have you always understood that's the case when selling to larger businesses?
I hope so. There's a lot I don't know versus what I have learned over the years. And even in phase 3, like you were asking about before, I didn't even know what good looked like in a sales organization until I really got to phase 3 and all that rigor. So there's a lot, but the people piece, I think I learned very early. It's a little cliche, but it's a great book. I read How to Influence People and How to Win Friends and Influence People, the classic Dale Carnegie book from, I don't know,
1932 or something.
Yeah, 1932. Yeah, written a million years ago, century ago. I read it pretty early, and that was where I went from like an engineer who thought sales was icky to just understanding that the takeaway from that book was genuine interest. And I have genuine interest in people, and I like people, and I like learning things and people, and all of that is exciting and interesting to me. And so once I learned that it was just general interest and how powerful that was, that I think led me to. I think the most important currency you have in sales is authenticity and who you are. And so you should always bring yourself, you should bring the best version of yourself to your work motions, and you need to be professional, and that's important, but you have to be who you are. I think people have parts of their brain they're hardwired to detect inauthenticity. So I think I learned early on that authenticity becomes your brand, and certainly in sales, your reputation precedes you. Whether it's good or it's bad, it follows you around. I think it was Warren Buffett who said, he was talking to a firm that had gone through some trust and reputation issues, and he said, "Lose money for the firm, and I'll be forgiving. Lose a shred of our reputation, and I'll be ruthless." And I think that's really true. So I think that just speaks to how crucial it is to just be authentic and transparent and have high level of integrity in everything that you do in sales, because that will ultimately serve you well over the arc of a career, whether it's a small org or a big org.
So talk to me about managing salespeople through that. Right. So talk to me about the idea. You say, I want the client to be center. Yeah, I want the client to be the center of our sales process. You say, I want us to make sure we're client-centric. But how do you make sure, or what are best practices for salespeople to do that? Because I think sometimes it's really easy to get caught up in the construction of the proposal and the deal and the thing. And then you lose track, and all of a sudden it's like you're selling to an inanimate object, and sometimes that doesn't work out so well. So if you were talking to me as a salesperson, what are some advice you'd give me to do a better job of selling to the person instead of selling to the brick walls of the company?
Ben Franklin said, if you mean to persuade, don't focus on reason, focus on interest. And I'm getting the quote a little bit wrong, but like essentially what he's saying is like it's not really you're trying to convince somebody that you're the best because of XYZ reasons. You really need to get aligned with what their interest is in this process. And so that is understanding what outcome from this advances the business forward and their own career forward. And if you can get really tight alignment with their personal interest, then that's going to drive, I think, a lot more momentum on a deal than just saying like we have the best solution and this is great. And so I think that is just absolutely key. And that puts them at the center because you're understanding what they need to get done in their role and in their career in the next 3 months, 6 months, 12 months. I'm understanding what the business needs to do, and you're aligned really closely with helping them get that outcome. And that puts them right at the center.
That's awesome. I think it's interesting because oftentimes sellers still kind of forget about it, and it's not a human, it's not a thing. And so it's one of those things that I always like to hear from CEOs is like, how would you tell them to get better? As we get towards the end here, tell me this. And here's the hard question. What's the number one lesson you've learned in growing TAG over the last 11 years as it relates to how to be successful scaling and growing a company?
Okay. This one was a very painful lesson I learned early on, but it has served me very, very well from engineering, and it's in everything I do. My goal is to be a less shitty CEO at the end of the day. And what I mean by that is if I can just learn one thing to be slightly better at my job, whether it's engineer, CEO, sales, strategy, if I can just learn one small thing every day, that compounds wonderfully into remarkable decades. So it turns boring days and boring weeks and boring months into remarkable decades. And it really is that. Like you said I was a great CEO earlier. I don't particularly think of myself that way, but I do think that I have chosen to learn at a rate that satisfies me. And everyone can choose to learn, right? I was born with a limited set of talents and skills, and my IQ is set, but all of us can choose to learn things, and I have tried and not always succeeded, but I have tried every day to learn and just get a little bit less bad at what I'm doing. And so if you just take that to anything that you're doing, it's sometimes hard to see the progress on the daily level and the weekly level, but when you look back, you always want to be embarrassed by yourself from 6 months ago. And if you are, then you're making progress. If you're not, you got to rejigger your day and figure out how to learn more.
Yeah, be humbly confident, which is super hard to do.
Yeah.
Right. It's one of those things that just the complexities of just the idea are pretty staggering. So
I think humbly confident is a good way, but that is one way to put it. The other way is I am determined to get there, despite all evidence of the contrary. I believe I can get there. And that's all it is. It is just every day. It is just keep going. Yeah.
I was on a business panel recently, and somebody asked the question. There's 4 of us on there, and they asked the question. They said, what's the difference between the uber successful, and the rest of us? And it was similar to what you said. And I said, well, quite frankly, they're willing to do the work that nobody sees, the shitty work on a day-to-day basis that doesn't give them all the glory. Because they'll do all of that so that you'll see that small glimpse that you're jealous of.
If I get to uber successful, then I'll confirm that that's true.
You're on your way. I'm absolutely positive of that. All right, last question for you, Justin. So tell me, what are you most excited about? I mean, the markets are changing, things are going crazy. But if you look forward, tell me 3 to 5 years, what are you most excited about coming up?
I think that what excites me is that it's been 11 or 12 years in this business, and it's taken a long time to get to where we are. And it's going to take a long time to keep going and to get to further places that we are. But what excites me the most is when I look back at the company that we were in 3 years ago, 5 years ago, I don't really recognize that company anymore. Like, I don't know. I just don't recognize that company. I don't recognize my leadership. I'm embarrassed by it. Like, there's so many processes that weren't there. So like, what excites me is if that happens again. I want that to happen again. In a couple of years, I want to look back now and be like, what were we doing? And so if I can feel that, that feels really good when you take a pause and look back and say, like, we've made progress. We have made progress.
Well, that's awesome. Well, Justin, I really, really, really appreciate you being here and taking the time. So Justin, CEO and founder of Third and Grove out of Boston, one of my favorite cities. So first, if you think back on this as you're listening to this podcast, here's a couple things that I kind of want to get your mind around. One is Justin talked really great about some of the mindsets that are associated with how to be successful, whether you're in sales or you're out of sales. And the second was the importance of actually trying to understand and learn exactly what it is you need to do so that you can apply those daily lessons. So Justin, you have absolutely done nothing but bless the community that's going to watch this podcast. And so tell me this, if somebody wants to get in touch with Third and Grove, how would they do that?
Hit up our website or hit us up on LinkedIn. Yeah.
Well, and I guess I should say, or hit Justin up on his LinkedIn because he puts out a ton of great content all the time as well. So thank you for joining the Candid Sales Rep Podcast, and we can't wait to see you on the next episode. We'll see you soon.